Hello and welcome to the Atlas Agency, a channel all about Arkham Horror, the card game. I'm your host Brandon, and in this video I'll be reviewing the Guardians of the Abyss Scenario Pack, which was released on December 6th, 2018. Guardians of the Abyss contains two linked scenarios, the Eternal Slumber and the Night's Usurper, both of which were originally exclusive to Arkham LCG events in 2018. Players at Fantasy Flight's Gen Con 2018 Arkham event got copies of the Eternal Slumber, and attendees of Arkham Nights 2018 got the Night's Usurper. For all of us who weren't lucky enough to attend both of those events, the Guardians of the Abyss Scenario Pack compiles both of them into a single 78-card retail release. Before I get into my thoughts on the expansion, I wanted to start off by explaining how this product differs from the previous standalone scenario packs that have been released for Arkham Horror. This part of the Arkham product line, the standalone scenario pack, underwent some changes in 2018. Guardians of the Abyss is the fourth standalone scenario pack to be released for Arkham. The first two scenario packs came out very early in the game's life. Curse of the Rougarou came just 1 week after the core set's release back in November 2016. Then the following month, December 2016, we got the second pack, Carnival of Horrors. So it felt sort of rapid fire in the beginning there, which was definitely welcome at that time. The first deluxe expansion didn't come out until January 2017, so it was nice to have extra material for players to explore in that interim period. But once that first deluxe expansion did come out, the standalone scenario pack releases pretty much dried up. If you made it to Gen Con 2017 or Arkham Nights 2017, then you got an early copy of Labyrinths of Lunacy, but as far as retail releases, there was nothing in 2017. We didn't end up getting the general retail release of Labyrinths until June 2018, and in that long gap between Carnival and Labyrinths, it looks like the way this part of the product line is handled has changed. The Curse of the Rougarou and Carnival of Horrors scenario packs both were, and still are to this day, printed through Fantasy Flight's in-house manufacturing process, which is a different printing process from the one used for all of the standard Arkham releases. All the cards printed in-house look and feel slightly different from the cards in the regular Arkham expansions. It is noticeable. They're sold in a simple little plastic clamshell, and all the components inside are card-based. Like, instead of a campaign sheet, the setup rules and scenario resolutions are printed on cards, and even the label on the product is just another card. So that's the form these releases had been taking. It's a format FFG uses occasionally for certain types of supplemental LCG products. For example, all of the Lord of the Rings LCG Nightmare decks come this way. However, when we finally got Labyrinths of Lunacy at retail, it was not printed in-house like Rougarou and Carnival. It was a regular printing, the same quality as a normal deluxe box or Mythos pack, with a new package design that's basically like a larger version of a Mythos pack, and a mini booklet for the rules, setup, and resolution text, rather than having all that stuff on cards. Guardians of the Abyss follows the same format as Labyrinths of Lunacy. It comes in that same larger version of the Mythos pack, with standard printing for the cards and a mini booklet for the rules and other text. So if you have Curse of the Rougarou or Carnival of Horrors, or if you've heard me talk previously in other videos about the way those are printed, just know that Labyrinths of Lunacy and Guardians of the Abyss aren't that way. If you actually attended an event like Gen Con and got an early copy, that would have been printed in-house, but the retail version that you can buy today will look and feel like any of your other Arkham cards. I don't have any insider knowledge on this, but I do interpret this as being a good sign for the health of Arkham. My assumption is that Fantasy Flight uses the in-house printing for products they think may not have quite as high a level of demand. I could see demand being kind of an unknown factor in late 2016 when Rougarou and Carnival would have gone to print, but I think the game's established itself very well now, and the market certainly seems to be there for these supplemental releases, so it likely makes more sense now for Fantasy Flight to do full print runs of these using the regular printing process. Let's move on now to talking about what you actually get in the Guardians of the Abyss pack. This is a 78-card expansion, and as I've said, it contains two scenarios. As with all the previous standalone scenario packs, there are no normal player cards here for use in general deck building. There are a few story rewards that can be earned to go into your deck through playing these two scenarios, but there's nothing that you can just drop into any deck at will. It's all about these two scenarios. The two scenarios in the pack are linked, which is something we haven't seen before in this type of product. The first scenario is the Eternal Slumber, and again, this one appeared originally at the 2018 Gen Con event. Eternal Slumber is set in Egypt, in Cairo, and it has the players investigating a mysterious ailment that's causing people throughout the city of Cairo to fall into a coma-like sleep. The second scenario is the Knight's Usurper. This is the Arkham Knights 2018 scenario, and it continues and concludes the story that began in Eternal Slumber. A lot of the scenario cards in the pack are shared between the two scenarios, but each scenario has cards that are unique to it as well. Like Curse of the Rougarou and Carnival of Horrors, there are rules to play these scenarios either as standalone adventures or as side quests during a campaign. If you're choosing to use these as side quests, then they cost 2 experience each for you to insert into a campaign. You are allowed to play just one of the two scenarios as a side quest without doing the other one, so you could, for example, do the Eternal Slumber, but not Knight's Usurper. You're also allowed to play Knight's Usurper without doing Eternal Slumber first. Just note that it does prohibit you from playing them out of order, so if you do play Knight's Usurper without doing Eternal Slumber first, you're prohibited from going back and playing Eternal Slumber at all afterwards, which for gameplay and story reasons does make sense. If you're doing these as side quests, you don't have to play them back to back. You can do Eternal Slumber, then go back to your regular campaign and return and do Knight's Usurper later, though from an international travel perspective that does seem rather inefficient. On the other hand, there is always the time-honored tradition of pretending that your standalone scenario is occurring as a flashback. As with all the previous standalones, if you're playing these as side quests, you keep the same Chaos Bag as your ongoing campaign. If you are playing standalone mode, though, it has instructions for scenario-specific Chaos Bags, and there are 2 different difficulty options, one for standard and one for hard. This does allow for some scaling on the difficulty between standalone mode and side quest mode. Your bag should be a bit gentler if you're approaching this as a side quest, whereas the standalone Chaos Bag is really built to present a good challenge. I like the way that works out. It's just kind of a natural way to accommodate the different needs of the 2 modes. If the side quest was too brutally difficult, then that might disincentivize you from wanting to try it as a side quest for fear of kind of messing up your main campaign. Alright, so hopefully that gives you a good idea of what this product is and how it functions. Let's get now into the review part of this and talk about what I thought of Guardians of the Abyss. I'm going to comment first on some things that are common to both scenarios, then I'll talk briefly about each of the individual scenarios, and finally I'll end with overall thoughts on the product and a little purchasing advice. So, things common to both scenarios. First up, there's the theme and the setting. Obviously, this is an Egypt-themed set, and me personally, I find that to be an interesting theme for an Arkham game. I do hope this doesn't delay us too long from seeing Egypt used in an actual campaign cycle, and fortunately I would say that the scenarios here do leave a decent amount of thematic room unexplored, so if we do return to Egypt one day, I think there'll still be plenty of fresh corners for the game to poke into. Part of the theme is the artwork, and this pack uses a lot of repurposed artwork from previous Arkham games, which tends to happen a lot with these standalone scenarios. The fact that the Call of Cthulhu LCG had deluxe boxes themed around both New Orleans and Venice, I'm sure was a big part of why those settings were chosen for Rougarou and Carnival. Fortunately, Egypt has been used pretty often before in the Arkham Files line. Elder Sign and Eldritch Horror both had dedicated Egypt expansions, so there were plenty of good pieces for Guardians to draw from, and I think it shows. Your mileage may vary, but I think on the whole the art here is better quality than the previous standalone scenarios, and the better print quality helps as well. I think I've said this at times about Forgotten Age too, but I like that the palette and the tone here are a little bit different from the dark and gloomy settings that we usually get in this game, so the art gets a thumbs up from me. Next up, the encounter cards. So one of the nice things about these standalones is that they don't reuse any of the cards from the core set in their encounter decks. Everything you'll run into in these 2 scenarios is going to come from this pack, and I think the encounter cards here play pretty well. A few cards are pretty ordinary in terms of their effects, but they're at least nicely themed to this setting, but then there are others that manage to be pretty interesting. There's a sort of central gameplay mechanic that's prominent in both of these scenarios, and it weaves into several of these encounter cards. It's not the most exciting scenario hook that I've ever seen, but the treacheries do find interesting ways to interact with it, and some of them are pretty challenging, which I think is desirable for a standalone scenario. The last thing I want to mention here is the reward cards. As is typical for these standalones, there are some cards included here that you can earn as rewards for your deck by playing these scenarios. I think the rewards in Guardians are generally pretty interesting. A few of them I would say are even kind of exciting or splashy. If they were normal player cards, a few feel like they would be right at home at level 5, so that's exciting, and if you're a fan of reward cards, I think you'll be satisfied by what's in this set. Alright, let's move on now to talking about the individual scenarios in this pack, starting with the Eternal Slumber. So I think Eternal Slumber is a pretty strong standalone scenario, and what really stands out to me the most about it is its internal variety. Now, it's pretty common for scenarios to have different stages where the gameplay objectives shift from stage to stage. I think the Act and Agenda deck system in general lends itself to that. In Eternal Slumber, though, the stages feel especially distinct. In some ways, I would say that this one feels a little like a self-contained mini-campaign on its own, almost as if you distilled the entire Night of the Zealot campaign down into a single scenario. Some people might feel a little whiplash, especially in the first playthrough of the scenario, but for me it made for a really satisfying experience, and I don't think I even have much in the way of criticism on this scenario. It doesn't beat out Carnival of Horrors for me as my favorite all-time standalone, but it's definitely my favorite of the two scenarios in this pack. The second scenario, the Knight's Usurper, contains the second half of the story, and unfortunately this scenario didn't resonate as well with me. It's not that the gameplay's really that flawed, I didn't find it frustrating or imbalanced or anything like that. I think it's more of a case that the scenario just doesn't feel as unique or as memorable as any of the game's other standalone scenarios. Standalones usually tend to feel larger and more epic than a typical Arkham scenario. I got that feeling well enough from Eternal Slumber, but to me, Knight's Usurper falls short here. It seems more like a scenario that could have come out of a Mythos pack. I think I can point to two main reasons for that. First, I think this scenario suffers from the way that it overlaps with Eternal Slumber. Now, I understand that a good amount of overlap is going to be unavoidable when you're fitting two scenarios into a 78-card expansion. The earlier standalones took up about 60 cards each. At 78, this isn't that much larger, so I recognize a lot of cards are going to have to be reused in order to pull this off. But I think it feels more noticeable than it had to here, in part because the overlap is basically front-loaded. The earlier parts of Knight's Usurper feel sort of like you're stuck in a slice of Eternal Slumber. Most of the cards that are unique to Usurper come later in the scenario, and I think that hurts the experience a little and could have been avoided. Second, even ignoring Eternal Slumber, Usurper has a lot in common structurally with several previous Arkham scenarios, and I think that too does a lot to make Usurper feel less special and less unique. I definitely felt some deja vu playing this scenario. Eternal Slumber, even though it uses some of the same elements I'm referencing here, does a better job of featuring them in a way that feels a little different from what's come before. Now, there are parts of Usurper that do feel very unique, and there is some neat imagery and story text in the latter part of the scenario. Those parts are fine, but I think I would have preferred having new stuff blended through the experience more evenly. So we have one scenario that I really like, probably around an 8 on the 10-point scale, and another that's probably closer to a 6 if I'm being generous. But when it comes to Guardians of the Abyss as a product, I think the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And for me, a large part of that was the fact that this expansion offers what's basically a new option when it comes to modes of play. We've had campaign mode, we've had standalone mode, and Guardians works with either of those, but there's also the option to string together the two Guardian scenarios into a sort of mini-campaign. So starting the first scenario following the standalone rules, and then proceeding into the second scenario with the results and experience that you earned from the first one. I guess it's not technically laid out in the instructions that you can do this. The standalone rules are sort of silent on the issue of playing them sequentially, but it feels pretty natural, and it's the way that I mostly play these scenarios. I've generally found that now that we have a few full campaigns available, I'm not terribly interested in playing side quests during my campaigns. I've found that the standard Arkham campaign length of 8 scenarios is satisfying enough for me, and I don't usually feel the need to extend that by tacking on these side quests. If I'm doing 1 or 2 scenarios every weeknight, then I can finish a campaign in about a week, and that experience feels complete enough. I do miss getting to play with some of the reward assets from the standalones, but that's about the only downside. But I'm also sometimes looking for an experience that's shorter than that full campaign. Something I could do in a few hours' time, maybe spread out over a weekend. Options there up to now have been to either do a one-off standalone or play Night of the Zealot or Return to the Night of the Zealot. The standalones are nice on occasion, but I like campaign play enough that more often than not in the past, I would choose to do Zealot. But we're a few years in now, and I've played Zealot quite a bit, and although I still enjoy it, even with Return, I've got to admit it's getting somewhat stale. I think my dream product for Arkham right now would be a deluxe box with a self-contained 3 or 4 scenario campaign, something comparable in length to the Zealot campaign, maybe a touch longer. I'm not sure if we'll get something like that anytime soon. The Lord of the Rings LCG has its Saga Deluxe boxes, which are sort of outside the usual adventure cycles of Deluxe box followed by 6 packs that Arkham and Rings both share. So I sort of feel like we're owed an equivalent product in the Arkham line, but so far there's nothing to indicate that that's coming anytime soon. Guardians of the Abyss isn't quite that, but for the moment, playing it as a standalone mini-campaign is sort of the closest thing we have. And for me, the ability to string 2 scenarios together like that is a big selling point for this product. I can play something that's not Night of the Zealot, but not have to devote a ton of time to it, and still get some continuity between scenarios, and still feel like it was a complete experience. So while I would say Carnival of Horrors is a stronger individual scenario than either the Guardians of the Abyss scenarios, I think I could actually recommend Guardians of the Abyss as your first standalone scenario purchase. Having the option to do either a single standalone game or a 2-scenario mini-campaign to me makes this more valuable than the other standalone options. The conventional wisdom I usually see offered when it comes to purchasing order has been to buy these standalone products last, in part because they don't include any player cards. I don't know that I fully agree with that reasoning. Player cards are nice, but I think it is useful to have an option or two for standalone play for when the situation calls for it. So I kind of wish I could recommend that you get this after you have maybe 1 or 2 full regular cycles of the game. Unfortunately, though, there is a problem with that. And that's because, at a very minimum, you really need to have played through at least the Forgotten Age Deluxe box before you do Guardians of the Abyss. Guardians borrows some elements from Forgotten Age, and I think it's really ideal to be exposed to those things in Forgotten Age first. That'll not only preserve the ideal Forgotten Age experience for you, but it'll also reduce your cognitive load as you try to work through Guardians. So I strongly recommend that you go in that order, and then for reasons related to the difficulty of Forgotten Age, I would not recommend picking up Forgotten Age before either of the 2 earlier cycles, Dunwich and Carcosa. So if you are in the position where you're just starting out and you really want to stand alone but haven't worked through those cycles yet, you might need to look at Carnival of Horrors instead of Guardians if you can't wait. If you are caught up through at least the Forgotten Age Deluxe, though, then I think Guardians would be my first choice for a standalone for the reasons I've outlined here. On the other hand, if you don't care about stringing the 2 scenarios together, I still think Carnival is the better overall individual scenario. Price-wise, by the way, I think you're looking at a $5 difference in MSRP between Guardians and Carnival. Wrapping up here, I think this is a good product despite some issues with the second scenario, and I think it's a worthwhile addition to your Arkham collection. The highlight of the expansion for me is the Eternal Slumber, which is a good standalone scenario with some nice internal variety, but beyond just having that as a nice standalone experience, I see value in this because of the way it can act as a sort of mini-campaign. That's all for this look at the Guardians of the Abyss scenario pack. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it all made sense. As always, thanks for watching the Atlas Agency, and good luck in your own investigations of the mythos.